Hashmi Memorial Trust in New Delhi, a leader in the resistance to communal and sectarian forces in India through its public cultural actions. Mr. Rahman, who also lives in New Delhi, and thank you for doing this interview with us.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you all for coming. That's actually a pretty old bio which is on the net. Forgot to mention that I curated a big exhibition here at the Baudaji Dad, which was a retrospective of J.H. Thakkar, the fantastic photographer from Dadar, who did photographs of the very young actors before they became stars of the Bombay Hindi cinema in the 1950s. That was up, I think, for 6 or 7 months. 6 months. Yeah. And curated, subsequently a number of shows, but that's... Today's lecture, which I call Modernism in Sight, is actually about architecture. I have a background in architecture. My father was an architect. He worked for the CPWD in Delhi. Had initially, he graduated from MIT in the 40s, was one of the first students to study in the US architecture, was a student of Walter Gropius, and came back. He was from Calcutta, came back and worked in the Bengal PWD. I do architectural photography professionally, but what I'm going to show you today is a slightly different take on architecture and photography. This is a big installation that I just mounted at the Gwangju Biennale, which is in South Korea. And it's a 35-foot long wall installation which includes my photographs, some of my father's archival photographs from the 50s, some of the posters that I've done with SEMA, the Safdar Hashmi Memorial Trust, all of which are actually related to site and to architecture. It's the first time I had done a variation of this at the Houston Fotofest earlier in the year, which is a huge Biennale of photography which happens in Houston in the US. And this year their focus was on India. And I had gone there towards the end of the show, and I had no idea of the scale of the Houston Fotofest. It was a huge, huge event. And almost each photographer almost had a solo show as part of it. They had huge spaces, massive. In fact, when I saw it, I realized the single biggest exhibition of Indian art in the US in any medium. So there was a variation of this which was up in Houston, and what I'm going to show you is what I ended up showing in Gwangju. And this lecture got constructed because the show that I was in Gwangju was curated by a young curator who's now at the Tate in London, Clara Kim. She had started working on looking at artists who were looking at architecture when she was in Los Angeles. And this work that she put up in Gwangju was a sort of expanded version of what she did. And I was very struck by the show, the artists that she found, how they are relating to modernist architecture in different parts of the world through very different media. So this is a look at how people are looking at architecture now, not through a conventional architectural photography or architectural drawing sense, but through more expressive means. This was how it was mounted on this wall in Gwangju. And as I told you, I've been doing architectural photography professionally. I've been photographing, particularly in Delhi, for architects like Raj Rewal, a lot for Charles Correa, many other architects. I used to do a lot of work for Inside Outside magazine, if you remember that. And 2009, the Rabindra Bhavan in Delhi, which had been designed by my father, which was the headquarters of the Lalit Kala Academy and the gallery, which was one of his key buildings. It was a building that he evolved actually working with Nehru. And it became a key building in his professional life, because it was one of the first buildings where he broke out of the rigid Bauhaus modernity, which he had been doing for most of the office buildings and school buildings and universities and housing in both Bengal and in Delhi up until that time. And Ashok Vajpayee was chairman, I think, then, and I ended up having a huge tussle with him, because the drawings of Rabindra Bhavan were no longer in the CPWD, but I had copies of the drawings at home and I happily gave it to them, and then they ended up completely messing up and destroying the building. So I led this big campaign on what was happening in the Rabindra Bhavan, and I then got interested. It happened because of this personal connection. I got interested in looking at what was happening to modernist architecture, over time. Classic buildings which had been built either in the 50s or the 60s, and how they were being either demolished or altered. So this was a work that came out from that. This is set of staircases from a building my father had done, the Curzon Road Hostels, which was built in 1967. And the black and white pictures you see are his photographs. He was a very good photographer himself, photographed all his own buildings. The color pictures are my pictures done in 2009, showing the very same structures as they existed then. And they were, of course, not in great shape. So I started working by combining images, combining text, press cuttings, etc., because a lot of this was coming out, these battles were coming out in the press at the time. This is a detail of the work in Gwangju. The top part is on the Rabindra Bhavan and what was happening and what happened subsequently after 2009. With a bit of a history of how that building evolved. It evolved from work he had done in Bengal. The first memorial to Gandhi was done by him, Gandhi Ghat, which is up there, the picture with Nehru. And Nehru inaugurated it. It was a modernist building, but evoking traditional religious architecture, but done in a completely modernist idiom. So it had a temple shikhar, a mosque dome on the top, and this long vault, which when you saw from the river looked like a Christian cross. And Nehru had loved the building, met him there in 1949, when he inaugurated the memorial, and then told him to shift to Delhi. Below that, around that you see images of the figures, Maulana Azad, Gandhi, Nehru, images that I've made which are the figures of these people in our contemporary times, which are slightly ironic, so it combines those histories. Below that you see, it's a bit out of focus. Can you see properly? Is of course the big demolition of the Hall of Nations in Delhi, building which had been designed by Raj Rewal in 1972 and had become a kind of world classic because it was engineered by Mahendra Raj, who's an absolute genius engineer and a genius in working with concrete. Mahendra Raj had started out as a young 20-year-old doing engineering for Le Corbusier in Chandigarh and became a master of concrete engineering. The Hall of Nations, you see a square picture of the inside with this pyramid structure, a space frame, which should have been constructed in steel. But this is 1972, we didn't have enough steel in India. This is still a time where resources were very limited, but architects were very adventurous because of the limited resources. They pushed their design and their technology to the fullest with an idealism, which was very much the idealism of that first 2 decades of independence. And the building was built literally by hand, a very complex structure. Mahinda Raj has about 600 engineering drawings of this building, and the drawings themselves are absolutely spectacular. I've shown some of them in a show I had done at the Kiran Nadar Museum. So this combined the Rival building, the demolished building, the posters. We had led a big campaign to try and save this building, which unfortunately we were not able to. It was blown up in the middle of the night in April 2017 when the case was still in the Supreme Court. But the court had not given a stay, and they did it over the weekend before the court could be approached again on a Monday. On the right is another building by Joseph Stein, which was recently demolished also in the trade fair. So those are my pictures of the building and then the demolished buildings. And below that is the site now, which is all empty, with this very garish convention centers being built by a Malaysian firm. On the left, you see in detail the next. This is a close-up of on the left side of the frame, you see the interior of a building which was an ancillary building to the Hall of Nations, which was the Nehru Pavilion, which was an underground structure, a square internal pyramid, which had been designed to hold the very famous exhibition on Nehru, which was done by Charles and Ray Eames, the great California designers, in 1965 after Nehru's death. And this exhibition was the exhibition which led, it was the beginning of NID. This was the first exhibition that NID worked on with the Ames. And this exhibition became internationally very famous and historic because they developed this whole notion of a timeline history, which was a graphic timeline to show cultural events, historic events, architectural events, political events, etc., through this wonderful wall design which included textiles, objects, folk crafts, sound, material, etc. So this was designed to house that exhibition. That exhibition has now been torn apart and the building has been blown apart. This is part of the demolition of Nehru. That's a section on the Hall of Nations and the demolished building. And this was the Stein, the first India Art Fair was held in this building, which was on the left. In fact, I think that's a photograph that I took when that first art fair happened. And on the right is the demolished building earlier this year. So this was, for me, it was a different way of engaging with architecture and looking at architecture and putting out these debates in the public sphere. This was shot shortly before it was demolished of the Nehru Pavilion with the Ames exhibit inside. This is housing which my father had done in 1954-55. Which also was classic, was built in thousands of units. Again, when we had very few resources. And this housing became very famous because it was very practical. It was literally a one-bedroom, little tiny flat. But it was designed in a way which accommodated our living habits. And these were basically for all the officials who were coming to Delhi, bureaucrats, junior bureaucrats, etc., who were part of the government. So generations of the people who have run our government have lived and been born in these flats, and they're now being torn down. You see the lower image, where the land is now being, in a sense, parceled out, half the land to the private sector. And they started cutting down all the trees. There was a big ruckus about cutting down the trees from the citizens of Delhi. The Supreme Court stepped in. So the tree cutting has been halted for now. But the demolitions are going on, and God knows what they're going to end up building in a city which is already drowning in pollution and with cars. I started looking at different histories, and there were personal links in many of the episodes that I put on the wall. This is around the flat that I live in Delhi, which is in what was Curzon House. It was an old colonial building in civil lines that Curzon had lived in for a few years. So on our gate, we have a little plaque that says Curzon House 1903. And right next to my compound, which the Oberoys had bought, they tore it down, they built condominiums, these little flats. Right next to my compound is the famous Nicholson Cemetery, which is where all the British died during the big battle for Kashmiri Gate in 1857, through which they invaded Old Delhi in September, October of 1857. So the site where I am is a very historic site, and Kashmiri Gate is right next door. There are pictures here of the cemetery of Kashmiri Gate, a map, and an old lithograph showing the British assault. And below that you see a poster which I had done for Zahmat, which was, we had done a commemoration of 1857 many years ago. And this whole poster was actually about the architectural and destruction of the city, because 1/3 of the city of Delhi and almost half of the inside of the Red Fort Palace was demolished by the British. So you see maps there with all the areas of demolition and old buildings before they were demolished and then afterwards. So this was a poster which had come out, I've forgotten what year it's up there, for 2007 I think, or 97, I can't remember. So it combined various aspects of the work that I was doing. Similarly, with Ayodhya and the demolition of the mosque, which happened in 1992, the lower poster was a poster that I had done for Zahmat in 1993, which led to our big program in Ayodhya later that year. And this was looking at the issues that demolition had thrown up before people like us who regarded ourselves as secular citizens of a secular nation. It dealt with architecture, it dealt with art history, it dealt with mythology. The poster was a very text-heavy broadside, which we sent out in about an edition of 4,000 to people all over India, students, activists, artists, etc. And it led to an exhibition called Hum Sab Ayodhya. There are excerpts from that exhibition above, which are the color and black and white photographs. The middle photographs are citizens of Ayodhya, and the top are architectural elements, because we talked about the cultural synthesis that is very obvious in Ayodhya. It's actually architecturally quite rich as a city and a town. So that was a narrative including the press cuttings of the demolition of Ayodhya. And there was a section on New York. I'll just run this little video, which first time I've actually mounted a video in the middle of any work that I've done. And the video is from New York. You'll see the New York section. This is just a detail of the install. And this is around the corner from my loft where I lived in New York. And I think, Ravi, you're on the fire escape in that photograph. Is that Mrinmoy in the front with me? Yeah. And these are my pictures of the burning wreckage of the World Trade Center. and old pictures that I had done of the World Trade Center many, many years before. So it looked at that region in New York where I lived, where my loft was, including that video, which was a very bizarre moment. There's this paint, the Brooklyn Bridge was in front of my window, and the Brooklyn Bridge actually has a symbolic connection to India. It was designed by a German engineer who had emigrated to the US, and it was the biggest structure built in the US at the time, which was 1882, I think it was inaugurated. And it was the symbolic link to the connection to cafe. Columbus had come to India had come to the US looking for India, and found this other continent, and found these people whom they call Indians, because he thought that they had found the route to India, which of course they hadn't. So in a conceptual way, in 19th century America, the finishing of that bridge was the last link, the link to that mythical cafe across the East River. There's a very interesting history, which is why the bridge has been painted. Poet, Walt Whitman, many great American poets have written about the bridge. It's a very powerful cultural symbol in America. This is a wider detail showing you the ensemble. The video was shot by chance. These Hasidic Jews who were leaving a protest and walking in front of this mural, which is painted around the corner from my loft, back to their buses. It was sort of a surreal moment. And since these attacks, both Ayodhya and New York, had a religious basis, I was interested in this whole notion of, a religious procession passing through historic architecture. It was just evoking, it didn't mean anything more than that. It was evoking this whole sense of religion and space at that site. Next to that was a section on Punjab. And the black and white photos that you see have become iconic. They're photographs that I made when Indira Gandhi was assassinated, and when the 1984 riots took place in Delhi against the Sikh community. These are actually not pictures of the violence, but the immediate aftermath in West Delhi, across the Jamuna, where I had gone with a group to give relief to people who were suffering. And the larger picture is this woman holding the finger of her husband who had been killed, and his finger had been chopped off to remove his gold ring. And that was all that she had left of him, a few locks of hair and his finger. And these pictures are now on permanent display at the Bangla Sahib Gurdwara in Delhi. And when they were put on public display, she came. I hadn't actually written down her name. I had written down her husband's name, the man who died at the time. But she came and saw the photographs and said that that was me, that's my picture. And her name was Nanki Kaur, which I found out about almost 30 years after the event. On the top are my very conventional and straight architectural photographs of the Khalsa Heritage Center, which has been built in Anandpur Sahib, designed by Moshe Safdie, the Israeli architect. And in a sense, that building was built by the Badals as a kind of reassertion of Sikh identity and Sikh pride, very much after 1984, after what had happened in 1984. Below that is my poster for Sehmat on Jallianwala Bagh. I was again combining these various histories and, in a sense, personal engagements with the history of Punjab. Jallianwala Bagh, as you know, the centenary of the event is coming up next year, April. And I'm right now reworking this as a calendar for Sehmat, which will be out shortly, hopefully next month. But this looked at the site again, right after the event, when a photographer actually from Maharashtra, Narayan Veerkar, very little known, but a great photographer, had done many pictures of Jallianwala Bagh and the aftermath, which were very key photographs in our national movement. And that's one of them, with the man pointing out the bullet holes. And in this we had texts of banned poems, banned theatre pieces, Tagore's resignation when he gave his knighthood back to the crown over Jallianwala Bagh, poem by Sarojini Naidu, Gandhi's letters, etc. Combined all those histories in this big broadside. So this was looking at layers of meaning in sight and in architecture. And I ended with Gujarat. This was the Gulbarg Society in Ahmedabad, where about 69 people were chopped alive and burnt alive. And the building in the far corner where you see with the man standing is actually the home of Ehsan Jafri, who is the senior Congress former MP who was hacked alive and then burnt alive in that house. These are all the burnt out ruins of a fairly modernist middle-class housing society where, fairly well-off Muslims were living. And I, many years ago, combined, what I did is I had taken photographs of survivors from the riots. And we had worked extensively with them with Tista Setalwar over the years with Sehmat. And I put those portraits, I hung those portraits, small portraits, in the ruins in Gulbarg as a long-lasting exhibition. They were very informally mounted. I don't know if they're still up there. But I recreated that as the last piece in this. So this was the big ensemble I did. Now, curiously, just before I went to Gwangju, there was an exhibition by a young artist called Parivartana Mohanty in Delhi at the Vadera Art Gallery. Parivartana had seen an exhibition that I had done, curated, of the photographs, remarkable photographs of modernist architecture done by Madan Mahatta, which I had actually brought here to the Max Muller Bhavan also a couple of years ago. Mahatta had made these pictures from 1955 to 1980. This is his classic photograph of the interior of the Hall of Nations, right when it was built, which was in 1972. And in this photograph, the figure, the tiny figure there in the shadow, is the architect Raj Rewal. And Mahatta made another technician stand in that piece of light, which is coming through the structure. Now, Parivartana had listened to my lecture, he saw these photographs, and he ended up making this very interesting show, which was a response to that lecture, the photographs of Madan Mahatta, going to see the building himself. It got demolished while he was in the process of making this exhibition. He made paintings, installations, sculptures, and videos. And it was a very interesting, I'll show you some of this is a painting based, a very large painting based on the photograph by Madan. Detail. And this is a video. Now what he did was he filmed the photographs as they were hanging in the Kiranara Museum through the glass with a video camera, and then made his expressive videos based on those pictures. And I'll show you a small excerpt. So he essentially creates the structure of the building, but with these human figures. And what he got very interested in were the little figures which appeared in Madan's photographs, which I hadn't even paid attention to. You know, they're very ancillary elements in those photographs, but that's what he took off from. That was what caught his attention. He extrapolated it through various myths that he got interested in, which were on Icarus, and also this tale that he had heard in Orissa as a child on a Kala Pahar, this guy who used to go and demolish mountains, a tale that he was told by his mother. So it was a very interesting mix of reactions. You see, he hung these video screens. This was a detailed video of those two figures in front of a painting, which was an oil painting. This is the installation shots in the gallery. Detail of a very large painting, again of those, taking from the video the notion of the figures creating the structure. And here you see how he starts looking at the figures in the photographs of Madan. He focuses on this family and he creates a story around them that maybe these were laborers who had built that building and maybe they're from Rajasthan. And that's the husband, the wife, maybe the sister and her child. But he focuses on these figures which were actually quite tiny in the photographs. That was Raj Rewal, who had come to the day when we had a discussion, a walkthrough in the gallery about what Parivartana had conceived of, how he made the show that he made. And I found it a very fascinating show because how it took off from those very formal architecture pictures, but responded, a young artist responding by making this exhibition literally around just one or two photographs from that exhibition. It was a very, very moving exhibition actually. This is another young photographer. This is Vicky Roy, who was a runaway kid, become quite well known now. He was rescued by the Salam Balak Trust of Meera Nair in Delhi, and Vicky has kind of become a protege of mine. These were pictures that Vicky made in the Himalayas. And I found them fascinating because this is a completely unromantic look at the Himalayas. Normally when people go and photograph the Himalayas, you get these beauteous landscapes, river, forests, greenery, fantastic mountains. Vicky, on the other hand, went and photographed what was being done by building and construction and road building across the Himalayas, and it was a pretty bleak vision. And I found these photographs fascinating because they were very powerful and completely, as I said, unromantic. They were quite direct expressions of, in a sense, the ecological degradation that new building was causing in that incredible zone. This is Simla, if you can believe it. And I had curated the show of his, which also was in Vadera Gallery. These are a couple shots of the installation. And what I did is I took two images, one by Nicholas Roerich, who was of course famous for his drawings and paintings of the Indian Himalayas. Roerich was a mystic. He looked at the mountains, with a mystical vision. He believed in their spirituality, etc. So this was a big vinyl print from the collection of Kiran Nadar Museum. And I superimposed Vicky's photographs on these images. It's a detail. And similarly, in the upstairs room, I took a classic landscape photograph by Samuel Bourne, which was in the Al-Qazi collection, and superimposed these other pictures on that. So, in a way, it was contextualizing what Vicky was doing, in the a little bit evoking the history of visual engagement with the Himalayas from the past, both photographic and artistic. And this is another young photographer called Chandan Gomes. This is Delhi, and here is a photographer who's looking at the sites of waste, these huge mountains of garbage. So it's a different way now of looking at urbanism, and I'm very fascinated that these young photographers are engaging with our urban environments and our building like this. Many of these are now on fire and are smoking and are adding to the already deadly pollution in Delhi now. Here. So this was Chandan Gomes. Now switching back to Gwangju. Clara Kim made this exhibition, as I told you, of artists she found which were not from the USA, not North America or from Europe. Some of them lived there and practiced there, but she looked at the work that was coming out of Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, Asia and Southeast Asia. And this is Tanya Goel, who's a painter from Delhi. And I had seen Tanya's work. You see that abstract painting in the back, which she has shown in Bombay also, I think at the Mirchandani Gallery. And she does these, very elaborate grid abstract images. But what caught me in Gwangju, and I had not known this part of her practice, was that she has been, and that's Tanya in the frame, she has been picking up pieces of all the houses and buildings which are being demolished in New Delhi, particularly in Defense Colony where she lives. These are all houses which had been built in the 50s and the 60s. Into the 70s, all of which are now being torn down to build these multi-story apartment units. So she has actually gone and collected fragments of these buildings and also documented the buildings. And she uses some of the pigments of the cement, etc., to mix into her paint to make those paintings. And when I saw this, I got very excited because this was sort of my cup of tea. And I said, I had no idea that your paintings had any relation to this. And if I had seen your paintings with what you had installed, with the remnants of these buildings, it puts it in a completely different context. And for me, they go together. One is not separate from the other. That little hexagon jali almost in the foreground is actually a copy of the jali from the Rabindra Bhavan of my father from 1961. This was from a house in Defense Colony. And on the back, she had small images which documented the buildings. This is where that Rabindra Bhavan jali came out of. This is A block, Defense Colony. And little prints, just a straight documentation of where these pieces had come out of. And I found this, what I found stunning about the show that Clara had done was the work that she had assembled from many different people actually spoke to all the other work. This is a video by Amy. Let me pull out my text now. This is Amy Siegel, who's from New York, and this again was work that I was not aware of. Made videos in 2012. She started seeing the chairs from Chandigarh being auctioned in London and in New York, in Christie's, etc. These were chairs which had been designed, some by Le Corbusier, but mainly by his cousin, Pierre Jeanneret. And they were very simple wood structures with the, with the cane work on them. So what she does is she makes a video called Provenance, and she starts with the auction in Christie's of these chairs, which are selling for huge amounts of money, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 each. So she starts with the auction, and then she traces back to the city of Chandigarh with the furniture in situ. And I'll show you, these are just done with my iPhone off the wall. I'll show you pieces of the videos. Beautifully shot. This is in the assembly in the Secretariat in Chandigarh. Much of the video has these very slow tracking shots throughout. And you get glimpses of how the furniture is piled up in a sort of wreck. Another little detail. So here is somebody who's looking at an element of modernism, which is the furniture, which became very key and now has become very stylish in design terms, especially the authentic original furniture made in the 1950s, which is being, in brackets, restored and sold in auction in Paris and London and New York. But this is a different way of looking at the legacy of modernism. One quick last one. This is the furniture after it has been bought in auction in designer homes in England. Oops, sorry. this is work by Damian Ortega, who is from Mexico City. And his work, again, is a completely different take. What he did is he took the plans of classic modernist houses which were built in this one neighborhood in Mexico, which was built on lava mounds, lava hills. And all the great architects, Luis Barragan, etc., had built in the 1940s and the 1950s in that neighborhood. That neighborhood those houses are now being torn down, demolished. There was a very famous sculpture made by a modernist architect, by a sculptor in Mexico, which was a sculpture of this giant snake, because that area was known for the snakes, and the snake has a mythological connection in Aztec tradition, and Mexico was the center of the Aztecs, who were vanquished by the Spaniards. So what Ortega has done, and he writes that that neighborhood is like the snake shedding its skin now with what is happening to those houses. So he takes leather and he does the plans of the buildings in leather and he cuts them out. And then he hangs the plans like this in leather on meat hooks. This is a detail. And this is how they're hung. And he's also designed them to be worn. So you can wear these sculptures as a fashion accessory. So there's a little bit of irony there also. But again, this is looking at a modernist history in this completely ironical way. This is Lais Mirha, who is from Sao Paulo in Brazil. And she takes two iconic buildings. This is the famous President's Palace in Brasilia, designed by Oscar Niemeyer. And below is a famous old colonial building from southern Brazil. And what she did, very simply, is recreate one piece of each building in full scale inside the Gwangju exhibition. And this is what it ended up being. So these are plaster works which were created in sight. And that huge piece is actually a piece of the Oscar Niemeyer building lying on this colonial column. So it's her way of looking back at that history in Brazil. But it was quite a stunning piece in the middle. This is Terrence Cowell, who is Canadian and has done this work as partly as an architect. He's an architect himself, and his work is related to architecture history. He's done work on 3 embassies that the US built. One in Cuba years ago, the other in, this is the embassy in Saigon, and then one in Iraq. For this project, he took the embassy in Saigon because of its Southeast Asia connection. And what he did is he does a documentation of the building, the architect, the plans, which are on these tables under glass. But then he recreated in the back as sculpture the elements from the actual building in full scale. And that's this modernist jali, which used to be in the front of the embassy building in Saigon. And on the left is how they adapted it for security reasons once the Vietnam War took off and the embassy was being attacked all the time. That's a double-scale piece of the blast walls that were then installed around this building. So he looked at this whole history of how this modernist building gets adapted for a security situation. And of course, in the first part, you see that famous image which is at the fall of Saigon when the helicopters lifted off the US embassy in Saigon with people screaming and scrambling to try and get on them to escape. And these helicopters took whoever they could to the aircraft carrier, and then they dumped the helicopters off the aircraft carrier because they couldn't carry all that weight on the ships. So this was Terrence Cowell's piece. This is Ala Yunus, who's Iraqi. She's an Iraqi architect, and she had done a version of this history of the modernist architecture of Baghdad, which I had seen many years ago in the Guggenheim Museum, which was very similar, installed like this, where she had old photographs, plans, letters, press cuttings, etc. But she evolved this in Gwangju to look at the work of women architects. Because when she had done that first show, there were a couple Iraqi architects who saw the show in London. Of course, the most famous Iraqi architect was Zaha Hadid. And people, forget that Zaha was from Baghdad and who sadly died. So there was a very interesting piece of looking at complex histories, but as an installation. This is a piece of the stadium in Baghdad, which had been designed by Le Corbusier. Both Corbu and Walter Gropius had done buildings in Baghdad in the 1950s. And she has these images, little statues of the women architects around a piece of the model of the stadium. This was Alexandra Arecia, who's from Havana in Cuba. And these are actually wall tapestries. These are woven in wool. And what he has done is he has taken photographs of the corners of buildings in Havana, which are wearing away and have signs of decay or, the patina of age. And with those images, he's created these graphic, almost masks, and woven them into these tapestries and hung on the wall. This is Pio Abad, who's from the Philippines. And what Pio did is he took a photograph of the chandelier of a classic modernist building which had been built in the 60s by Imelda Marcos and Marcos as a great symbol of, the progress of the Philippines at that time. And they had a big convention there. So he's taken the chandelier from that building. And in that building, they had this big international convention. It was supposed to be, the Philippines coming into the international age. And a lot of Philippine workers at that time went to the Middle East, like our workers go. And a lot of them got involved in building Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And what he's done is he found these perfume bottles you see on that shelf. He took the image of the chandelier and created this wallpaper. So his installation is just this giant wall of this wallpaper, which is images, graphic images of this chandelier, with these shelves. And he found these buildings, these are perfume bottles made of the modernist, the buildings in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, in gilt, in gold, but they're actually perfume bottles. So that's that hotel on the edge of Dubai. This is the Burj Dubai, the tallest, I don't know if it's still the tallest building. So this was his look. This was Ito Barada, who's from Morocco. And his project was, let me get his text. This was a multi-layered project. This was, there was in 1960, there was a terrible earthquake in the city of Agadir in Morocco. So he takes he gets vintage footage from that time, and what happened is there were these big debates of rebuilding the city of Agadir. Do you build it in what style, in modernist architectural style, etc. So he takes the plans of some of these buildings that had been reconceived after this terrible earthquake when many people had died, and he has drawn those plans out on that black wall, the curved wall in the back. On the wall there's a film which is footage from that time of the destroyed city. And he made these collages which are taken from press photographs of the period, where you see the caption on the back of the press photographs. He cuts out the buildings and makes these sort of very dainty little collages which relate to that history. And this is Mauro Restif, who's also Brazilian, but these pictures are from, if I can pronounce it, a neighborhood of Mexico, Tlatelolco or something, which I can't pronounce properly. It's actually a neighborhood where there were Aztec ruins. And from those ruins, after the Spaniards had destroyed the pyramids there, they had built a cathedral out of the material of the ruins. And surrounding that was this huge modernist apartment complex. So this is very straight photographic documentation, small black and white prints of that neighborhood of Tlatelolco, where there was a big massacre of students in 1968. Which had also happened in Gwangju, by the way, in Korea. There's a history of a student massacre in Gwangju. So it was interesting that these pictures, here you see the Aztec ruins, which were excavated, and the modernist apartment blocks in the back. That's the cathedral which the Spaniards had built, which goes back quite far, 16th century, in the middle of these Aztec Angela Ferreira. She is from, hold on, let me get back. She's from Mozambique and lives in Lisbon. And what she has done is taken the facade of a building. This is the work references a modernist building in the Democratic Republic of Congo designed by Claude Strobel in the last years of Belgian colonial rule. The facade becomes a sculptural device and performative platform for the song Ante dans les Mines, about a young man in fear of being recruited to the mining industry. There were two videos in these window frames. So she built a full-scale section of the building in the gallery with these two videos in the window spaces. One video was about this song of this boy being afraid of being recruited into the mining industry. And the other was a jazz band playing the famous African independence song, Independence Cha-Cha, which was originally composed by the father of Congolese modern music, Joseph Kabasele, while he was in Belgium to celebrate the negotiations of independence. So she combines these histories of independence and the mining rape of the Congo by the Belgians in this architectural ensemble. This is Shehzad Dawood, a fairly abstract work. To me, this was the less engaged actually with architecture, but his statement and his idea here was that he looked at the abstract paintings of Le Corbusier, some of which the murals that you see in Chandigarh, and Shehzad's work he works with fabric, with paint on fabric, with embroidery, etc. So he created these works of abstraction with neon, evoking in a sense that kind of tradition of abstraction from Chandigarh, but also thinking about abstraction in like tantric diagrams, etc. This was a very interesting work by Gwangju Biennale. This was he's from Angola and he works in Luanda and in Lisbon. This is the year 1975, or he's looking back at the year 1975 when the Portuguese abandoned the city of Luanda in Angola on the eve of independence. Based on the Polish writer-journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski's book, Another Day of Life, a first-hand account of the beginnings of the Angolan Civil War. The work speaks to this time of pandemonium as one world order was about to be replaced by another as independence factions vied for power. Kia's elegaic film captures the modernist buildings in Luanda, exploring the asphyxiant condition that characterized that moment when the future is lost and utopia has failed. And what he did was he made a video with these still images. These are still photographs, but on the video there's this fantastic recitation in Portuguese. And Portuguese is a very poetic language, it's almost, and it's a wonderful text. And it's a haunting text as these images fade, one over the other. I think there may be a little bit of video here. Yeah, I'm sorry the sound isn't very good. This is just the ambient sound from the... We build monuments, houses, whole cities, and suddenly it seems legitimate to rape the earth. The city is an organic statuary endowed with a soul. The future is uncertain. If any of you have read Ryszard Kapuscinski, did an amazing book on Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. These long form, they're almost like novelistic, journalistic writing, which is extremely powerful and very poetic. Translated, of course, from the Polish. This is Marwan Maui from Resh Maui, I guess. Not sure how you pronounce it. Whose work is on Beirut. He lives in Beirut. And what he's done is applying the traditional practices of blazonry or heraldry. Marwan creates a mapping of his native city of Beirut through a set of banners and coat of arms that corresponds to each city district. He made these for 300 and something districts, of which 59 were hung in Gwangju. And again, completely different. I mean, what fascinated me about this show is how people have used such different ways and formal means of reacting to a subject which links all of these people together pretty much in the same time period of the architecture from the 50s and 60s and 70s. And you end up with something like this, which is woven banners relating to a political history, the strife in Beirut, neighborhood by neighborhood.
Right-wing models, Ram?
Mm-hmm.
Right-wing models of
Not all of them. You know, some, yes, but that we have everywhere, like the Statue of Unity, which has just come up. Yeah. And I thought I would end with that. That's the Hall of Nations. Thank you. Not bad, I haven't gone too far over time.
You want to take question and answer session?
Yeah, sure. Questions, you may not get answers, but also any responses, any critique, any... And I've just shown you a fraction. There was much more work in Clara's show. And I was talking yesterday with Shalini and, you know, thinking about the artists in Bombay who worked with urbanism, well, actually any number of people. But Navjot, who'd done these works of very, you know, modernist glass facade buildings, these very elaborate drawings. So, you know, I think it would be interesting to put together a wider show. And when I saw this show, I've only shown you like half of what Clara had shown. There was much more. There was a fascinating video, which unfortunately I didn't shoot, of a building built in the 1970s in Seoul, which looks almost exactly like Nehru Place in Delhi. And it has become a place also almost like Nehru Place. Nehru Place is the big market for electronics. And if any of you have been there, it's this sort of Corbusian edifice which has been completely taken over by gigantic mess. And it's full of these shops which sell circuit boards, components of hard drives, etc. Similarly, in Seoul, this building has become a place where they sold videos, CDs at the time when those were being sold, or bootleg records. So it became a place where people would run to buy records that they couldn't get, like Pink Floyd, etc. And then there's a fascinating video film which is looking at what is happening in that setting, which was supposed to be like this very formal, beautiful, pristine, modernist structure, which has been overtaken by Asian chaos. The Asian chaos in Seoul is not too far from our chaos of our bazaars, and that's kind of, in a way, it's nice to see that there's a link of chaos. Any? Yeah. Yes, the second version of it was here at the Nehru Center. I don't know the condition of this exhibition. But the Delhi, there were two versions. One landed up at the Nehru Center here, and the other was mounted in Delhi. Actually, people now are trying to find out. Naman Ahuja just called me to ask what happened to the contents, and Pratapaditya Pal from the US has also got in touch, and the NID people, Ashok Chatterjee, etc. So I've told Ashok Chatterjee to file an RTI to find out what happened to the contents of that exhibition, because it's quite a historic show. Why is it disturbing you? But that's the point. I had also made one of Nirmala Sitharaman. She was the minister who was in charge, but the main person was this. That was actually a very tragic event, because that building really was an icon of world modernism and regarded as such. And there was a huge national and international campaign to try and save the building. The Indian Institute of Engineers, the Indian Institute of Architects, many architecture schools, professional architects, students, etc. had signed. Museum of Modern Art in New York, Pompidou museums in Japan, but nothing had any effect.
Was it beyond repair?
No, not at all. I mean, concrete, you have to do some repair work and treat. The Getty Institute in California started a big program to restore and repair a lot of the concrete work of Chandigarh. That's because they're all focused on Le Corbusier, which is happening on a very big scale now, including some of the buildings in Ahmedabad. But this building, it was a completely open space frame, and adapting it for full air conditioning, etc. was very easy, because this was just a shell. You could do anything on the inside. It was an open space and a huge space. And I didn't show you the videos that Parivartana had done, but he went, after he saw my exhibition, he went and made videos in the building of people. And if you see, there's a video of what they're going to build. If you've seen the videos of the Statue of Unity, or the video of the new police memorial in Delhi, or the video of what is coming up in Pragati Maidan, it's all, well, for someone like me, it's very depressing. They're very slick, computer graphics, but it's all about, a completely different ethos from what those buildings were about. And it's tragic that we're losing, that bit of history, because it is a piece of our history, including the housing. And my attempt was to at least keep one unit of each of the housing complexes in situ. So just as an example, and maybe turn them into local little clubs or something, but keep the building in, one section intact. Because there's a hell of a lot of land, because these were low scale buildings, spread out all over Delhi. Anyway, that's why this picture is up for so long.
But things like that, housing and all, it would be a matter of including modern designs.
No, that, of course, when the time that these, for instance, I went into this housing after many years, and we lived, my father was a government architect, we lived in government housing. We didn't have Western style toilets. We didn't have water heaters. My father had a spinal injury in 1970, and we were living in an apartment building he had designed, just 6 floors, which was huge in Delhi then. Delhi was not like Bombay, which had, taller buildings built by the British. So an 8-floor building or a 6-floor building was like a big thing in 1964 and 1965. And we had to get a European toilet because of his spinal injury. He could no longer, use the Indian toilet. And if you saw the kitchens which were built then, they were just a concrete slab. And people still use angiti, etc. In government houses. And this is into the late 60s. People forget the kind of resources we had. We didn't even have proper door hinges or door fixtures. We didn't have large glass. You couldn't make glass buildings because we just didn't have large glass. You had only, we only manufactured glass to a certain dimension in India. That all slowly started changing. Of course, big change happened after the economy opened up in the 90s. And of course it happens with photography also, because you couldn't buy cameras in India through the 1960s, so anyone who had access to cameras had it through some kind of connection. Either you had an uncle who went on some trip and managed to smuggle in a Canon or a Nikon, without customs grabbing it. You had to pay this huge duty. So we are coming out of an economic situation and economy like that. So those flats were built at that time. So sure, they need to be upgraded. You can do that with a very small flat also. I mean, you only have to see cities like Paris, which have these old buildings which didn't even have toilets, because the French would have like a common toilet in the building. They didn't have toilets in every apartment, even into the 70s and 80s in those old Paris buildings. But you can, all of that can be done, and they have done it in other places. Here it's, someone like Charles talked about what happened here in Bombay with the mill lands, etc. There's a whole history of the disaster of urban planning in Bombay, which was a city which could have been saved and something amazingly creative could have been done. Charles and his whole team, there were many people, planners, etc., who were involved, but nobody paid heed to those ideas. And similarly, that's happening in Delhi. The land is being basically parceled out, a lot of it, to the private sector, and this is government land. And you've got these huge apartment complexes coming up with thousands of cars, and we don't have space on the road for the cars to drive. They may be building parking. So the whole thing is, we are in a complete disaster zone.
Did they recycle any of the material that came from the demolition of this large building?
No, unfortunately, no. I was not in Delhi when the I would have sent people rushing to get pieces of those joints, because those, the concrete, technically what Mahinda Raj had designed, the joints which were made with reinforcing rods, and you had these illiterate workers. It's the most astonishing thing. You had these illiterate workers building this incredible structure. So it's like handloom. You're building a high-tech building, but like a handloom building, which is amazing. And just some of those joints needed to have been preserved and kept in a museum. But sadly, I wasn't here, and I think they were just blown up. Recycled, they've probably been dumped in some landfill somewhere. But there may still be pieces lying somewhere if one ever knew where they took them. Yeah.
Can Mr. Mahinda Raj's drawings be accessed anywhere?
Well, there's a wonderful book which was published on his work, which his son did about 2 years ago. Some of the drawings are reproduced in that, but the original drawings actually are just incredible. And I showed some of the originals in this exhibition at the Kiran Nara Museum, and they're huge. In fact, as I said, they're better than most of the art I've seen in 10 years, because they're just, they're hand drawn. This is the days before computer plotting, etc., and with washes to give a dimension, etc. They're just incredible. They remind me of Leonardo or something. They're that exquisite. He has 600 of drawings just for this one building. But all the buildings, he's an engineer. I worship him like a god. He's like 95 years old now. But an amazing man and an amazing talent. And he has the engineering drawings of all these buildings, almost all the big buildings, of all these architects. Mahinda Raj was the engineer. I just shot the stadium that he did in Ahmedabad, which I had never seen before, just 2 weeks ago. Incredible stadium done in the 1970s, which was conceived by Charles, but Charles doesn't really take credit for it as as a design. It's not even published in his book. It's really Mahinda Raj's work. It's this very complex, folded concrete structure. And I called him from the stadium. I said, why is this, who designed this? He said, well, it was Charles, but it's not really Charles. It's really an engineering piece. And he talked about this complex for this huge cantilever roof, which is thin shelled concrete, which is amazing. So those drawings, well, I'm trying to get some of the museums to acquire some of those drawings so that, and I'm hoping that they remain in India and not, go to museums outside India, which sadly a lot of Raj's work and some of the architects have already been grabbed up by either the Pompidou or by the Museum of Modern Art. So we are losing even that trace of that tradition here. But if you ever go to Delhi, you can try and go to his office and just ask. You never know. Are you an engineer or an architect?
I'm an architect. I'm a conservation architect.
Okay. What's your name?
Yeah.
And you work in Bombay?
Yes. I used to work in that field.
Okay. I think we're done.